Good day. As we now enter the third month of Ukraine's counteroffensive, it's becoming increasingly difficult, even in the West, to deny the reality that the offensive itself is now at a standstill. There's been a further cluster of reports. I'm not going to read them out in any detail, but we've had one from the New York Times, which speaks of, well, its title says, Ukrainian troops trained by the West stumble in battle. Ukraine's army has for now set aside US fighting methods and reverted to tactics it knows best. And if you go through the article carefully, it tries to take a positive spin on events, but it admits that the combined arms tactics in which Ukraine was trained have not delivered results. It suggests that the training that Ukrainian troops received were not up to the level that would have been needed to conduct successful combined arms tactics. Well, Brian Beletic and others, Daniel Davis, for example, have been making that point for months. That should come as no surprise. They also say that lack of air power, lack of air support, all those sort of things, the lack of firepower has also affected Ukraine's ability to conduct offensives to break through Russian lines. Again, if you've been listening to Brian Beletic and indeed to us here on the Duran and on this program, on this channel, that would also have not come as any sort of surprise. And last but not least, it says that Ukraine has reverted to light infantry attacks, though so far with only mixed results, and that the plan seems to be to try to wear down the Russian troops on the front lines. I'm not quite sure why it's assumed that the Russian troops on the front lines will be worn down faster than the Ukrainian troops are, but anyway, that's the theory behind this new form of attack in light infantry forces, despite the admission that this comes with very heavy casualties, and so far there's not very much to show. And we've also had another similar article, this time from NBC, and its title perhaps is even more pessimistic. It says, is Ukraine's counteroffensive failing? Kiev and its supporters worry about losing control of the narrative. Now, I have to say, I find that second part of the title the most interesting part of all. Anyway, we go on to read that some US officials are frustrated at the pace of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which has gained less than 100 square miles of territory, which, by the way, is true. It's not made any significant progress at all. And what, of course, articles like this don't mention is that the Russians, in their advance in the north, have probably gained at least as much territory as Ukraine has gained in its offensive, and perhaps even more than that. But anyway, let's put that aside. But look at that headline. Kiev and its supporters worry about losing control of the narrative. Now, Alex Christoforou and I have been discussing a lot of the time on the Duran that a lot of the conduct of the war, Ukraine's conduct of the war, indeed the West's conduct of the war, the US's conduct of the war, has been principally narrative driven. And here we see the admission slipping out in an article in NBC. It's not ultimately whether or not they win. Victory isn't quite the priority. It's keeping control of the narrative. If the narrative starts to take hold that the offensive has failed, then of course the problems, the political problems in the West and in Kiev will start to grow. Well, anyway, that's what the title of the article says. I ought to say that the article itself, when you read it, is more like the article in the New York Times talking about the problems Ukraine is encountering, conducting the offensive, talking about the various military obstacles that Ukraine is running into, discussing Ukrainian tactics and the disappointing outcomes thereof. But as I said, it's the title, in my opinion, the reference to the narrative, which ultimately gives the game away. And we see narrative construction underway, even as these two articles have been written. Now, without anything much to show on the battlefront, and I'll come to the situation on the battlefronts at the moment, but without much to show on the battlefronts, the media yesterday and today has been relentlessly focusing on the fact that these drone attacks, which Ukraine launched against Novorossiysk the day before, and another drone attack which was in the Kerch area, not far from the Crimean Bridge, by the way, and which was launched early this morning, that they've each done damage to two Russian ships. The first was the damage to the landing ship, which I discussed in my previous video. The second is damage done to the engine room of a small Russian oil tanker, 8,500 ton tanker, which apparently was returning to Russia after delivering oil to who knows where. It's been suggested that it might be Syria. This particular tanker is under sanctions because it has delivered oil to Syria. So this has been the major story in the media today, media in the West today. They don't have advances to talk about on the battlefronts. Last week it was Staromayorsk, which, by the way, the Ukrainians, despite the claims that were being made over the course of the previous days, they haven't actually fully captured. It is not under their control. Anyway, they talked a lot about Staromayorsk, this village of 839 people, as it was before the war, that was captured or not captured by Ukraine. That was the topic that people were talking about then, and today, and to some extent yesterday, it was the damage done to these two Russian ships. And an element of exaggeration has, of course, inevitably appeared. I've seen several reports, for example, which claim that the Russian warship was sunk. It has not been sunk. It did suffer damage. It did list. It was taken, however, back to port, and it is under repair. And I suspect that it's the kind of ship that can be repaired fairly quickly and will be back in service very soon. And as for the drone attack on the tanker, that is a rather interesting event, because one assumes that these drones are either remote controlled from pretty long distances, in which case, by the way, one suspects that the guidance information to these drones can be jammed, and perhaps the Russians will start working out how to do that. Or perhaps, if it was specifically targeting the tanker, it was launched from fairly close by, and given that we're talking about the Kerch Bridge area, that suggests that there is a mothership fairly nearby, and one wonders what flag that particular mothership was carrying. Anyway, that's one other possibility. Or perhaps, and this isn't something that people have discussed, perhaps the attack, the damage to the tanker was accidental. Perhaps the tanker wasn't the target at all. Perhaps this was a renewed attempt to attack the Kerch Bridge, but the tanker got in the way. I don't know what the answer to those questions is. I would say that traffic across the Kerch Bridge, which by the way is still operating despite the damage caused by the two drones that attacked a week or so ago. Anyway, traffic on the Kerch Bridge was briefly stopped, but it has apparently resumed. And I wonder, as I said, what the full story about this particular attack that damaged this tanker will turn out to be. I suspect that it was an accident. I suspect the tanker was not the target. I don't see why Ukraine would be hunting after an empty tanker, and perhaps in some point we will learn more about exactly what is going on. But there are unanswered questions about this incident, which no doubt the Russians are busy trying to figure out. Now, just before this program began, the Russian authorities in Crimea have issued warnings that there's been sighting of another drone. They've told people in Crimea to remain calm, people who are enjoying the sea, enjoying the beaches in Crimea, places like Yalta, major Russian resort city, by the way, constructed in the 19th century. The Tsars of Russia used to holiday there, the Livadia Palace, where Stalin received Churchill and Roosevelt during the Second World War, and where the Yalta Conference took place, is of course located in this area of southern Crimea. Anyway, the Russians have said that there's no cause for concern. This drone has been detected, and doubtless it will be destroyed pretty quickly as well. But the damage that these drones have done, and I think this is an important thing to say, the damage that the drones have done in the recent attacks has been superficial. The same with the drone attacks on Moscow, the aerial drone attacks on Moscow. They are inconsequential in terms of their impact on the Russian economy and on Russia's seaborne trade up to this point. The concern is not that these attacks are achieving anything very much. It is more about the way in which these attacks are being carried out. As I've said in my previous video, if they're being launched from ships using foreign flags and which are operating from ports on the Black Sea of the NATO states on the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria, then that is a very serious matter indeed, and it might invite Russian retaliation, though we will see what the Russians do. For the meantime, I suspect that the Russian priority will be to tighten security in this part of the sea. I suspect that there are problems operating drones all of these distances towards Novorossiysk and in the Kerch Strait. The drones, the seaborne drones, up to this time, have not shown any real success in this war. The only occasion when they did real damage was in that attack, that successful attack on the Crimean Bridge, which took place, as I said, about 10 days ago. The Russians are now building barriers to prevent further attacks on the Crimean Bridge, and I suspect that before long we will see that the Crimean Bridge will become relatively invulnerable to attacks of this kind. So the threat from the drones can be overstated. As I said, they've not achieved up to this point very much. The consequences, if NATO countries are directly involved in these attacks, potentially, is a completely different matter. So what has been going on the front lines? Well, the last 24 hours have been quiet. There's been very little activity. The commander of the Armour Special Forces unit, the Chechen forces, which have now, to the best of my understanding, either taken over or significantly reinforced the defences around Kleshchevka, southwest of Bakhmut. They say that there have been more Ukrainian attacks in this area, but that they have the situation fully under control, and that the Ukrainians are making no progress there at all, despite losing large numbers of men and machines in those attacks. This morning, shortly before I started to make this video, there were reports of another infantry assault by Ukraine, and I stress again, this is an infantry assault. The armoured attacks, the combined arms armoured attacks towards the Russian defensive lines have once again come to a stop. Ukraine has once again abandoned them. It was pushed into using these tactics in the first week of June, and it was pushed again into using these armoured combined arms tactics in the last week of July, on both occasions with catastrophic consequences. Anyway, this is an infantry assault. It's taking place south of Orechov. Once more, they're heading towards Rabotino, or at least they're trying to storm Russian positions, Russian trenches, south, north of this village of Rabotino. Reports again speak of the Ukrainians trying to shell the Russian defenders using cluster munitions. Now, various people, Daniel Davis, Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, Brian Beletic, they've all talked about the fact that cluster munitions are not particularly effective against fortified positions, including trenches. But one suspects that that's basically what Ukraine is left with. So another attack towards these trenches. Russian artillery is apparently back in operation. I'm not sure, by the way, whether the Russians have, for their part, started using their huge arsenal of cluster munitions. If they do, then, of course, the effect on these columns of Ukrainian infantry moving across the steppe land towards the Russian positions could be devastating. But anyway, as of this moment in time, I have no reason to believe that this attack is going to be any more successful than the others, and the early reports I'm getting from Russian channels, Russian sources, suggest that the Russians are confident once more of repelling this attack. There are, I should say, attacks of this kind. They happen every day. Some are on a bigger scale, some are on a lesser scale. This one seems to be on a bigger scale, but up to now, the Russians have successfully dealt with all of them. And Staromayorsk, the Vremevka Ledge area, it also seems that there the Ukrainians are stuck. By contrast, further north in the northern part of the front line, I read reports yesterday on Slavyangrad and other places that the Russians have expanded their bridgehead across the Zherebets River. They've now fully consolidated their position west of the Zherevets River. They're in a better position to advance towards the Oskol River. They're close, as I've said many times, to Kupiansk. Exactly what they're planning there, as I said, we will have to wait and see. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has been not exactly in the area, at least he's been visiting the headquarters of the theatre commander on the Northern Front, who is General Medvedev. And we learn that yesterday, somewhere or other, the Russians claim to have advanced by a full kilometre, which in this kind of war is actually a significant advance. So we shall see what happens. But overall, the picture remains of static front lines and Ukraine making no progress. And the result is these articles, this flurry of articles, which we have seen, and also attempts to preserve the narrative by talking up these pinprick attacks with drones against Russian ships. Now, I would say that there is another narrative that has begun to take hold in the West, which is that these drone attacks are supposed to wear the Russians down, complicate their logistics, oblige them to transfer air defense assets, in the case of Moscow, from the front lines to defend Moscow, thereby leaving the front lines exposed in some way. If you look at the scale of these attacks, it becomes obvious that that is not the case at all. None of that is true. There is no conceivable way that these pinprick attacks are going to have any effect on the Russian war effort, on the Russian economy, on Russian tactical or strategic dispositions, on the forces on the front line, that they're just not anywhere close to being sufficiently effective to achieve that effect. They lack the scale and the striking power. And incidentally, and whilst I'm on that topic, I noticed that over the last couple of days, we've been hearing less about missile strikes with Storm Shadow missiles, which makes me wonder whether those Russian attacks on those two air bases and on the warehouses that I discussed some days ago, which apparently were focused on destroying Storm Shadow missiles, might be having some effect, and whether perhaps Ukraine and its Western sponsors have taken a step back and are reconsidering the effectiveness of the Storm Shadow system, given Russian claims about having shot down lots of them, including allegedly 12 in a single day, in a single volley. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Nothing very much to report there. Stalemate, or well, not stalemate, deadlock on various parts of the front line. No Ukrainian advances. Now, before I actually turn to some more up-to-date things, because there are, of course, other things going on, both in the war and concerning it, which are unrelated to the fighting that we're seeing at the moment. I do want to revisit one particular topic, which is the withdrawal, the Russian withdrawal from Kiev in late March and April 2022. Now, this has often been cited in Western reports as an example of the Russians being pushed back from Kiev by the Ukrainian forces. And At the time that it happened, the Russians, of course, said that they conducted this withdrawal from Kiev on the basis of the agreements that were reached in Istanbul, which it looked as if those agreements were going to result in a settlement. And as a goodwill gesture, the Russians decided to withdraw their troops from near Kiev, and that they were certainly not forced into retreat. It was a political decision made in order to facilitate what were expected to be negotiations. Now, what I've noticed is that over the last few weeks, since the Russians have started to discuss the failure of the discussions in Istanbul, the fact that there was a draft agreement almost reached, but which was torpedoed by the United States and Britain, as has been confirmed, by the way, not just by the Russians, but as was reported at the time in the British media, and as has been confirmed by people like the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and the Turkish Foreign Minister Mr. Cavusoglu. Anyway, what the Russians are now saying is that they didn't just make a decision to withdraw their troops from Kiev as a goodwill gesture. The Ukrainians asked them to do it, and they agreed to do it in the context of a negotiation that appeared to be about to succeed. So the Russians, in other words, pulled their troops out from around Kiev at the Ukrainian government's request. Now, Putin has hinted at that, so has Lavrov. The Russian ambassador to Britain has now said that explicitly. Now, I don't know whether that is true, and it could be that the Russians are just making that up, that in fact there was no formal request or informal request or request of any kind from the Ukrainian authorities. I've not seen that contradicted anywhere. Perhaps the Ukrainians don't want to contradict it. There is the question of, if the Russians did it this way, why have they not reported it? Why have they not disclosed this fact in the past? Why haven't they pointed out Ukraine's bad faith on this issue? That they signed an agreement, asked the Russians to withdraw their troops from around Kiev on the strength of that agreement which had been signed. The Russians agreed, and then the Ukrainians, once the withdrawal had taken place, went back on what they had agreed to and pretended to have achieved a victory around Kiev, which in fact they never did. Anyway, why have the Russians not said that before? Well, there is a possible explanation, and that is, of course, that once again, the Russians have been made to look like fools, if this is indeed what happened. They've had ample examples of the Ukrainians making promises like the Minsk Agreement, for example, and failing to fulfill those promises, and pocketing any concessions that had been made along the way. And of course, the same is true, many Russians would say, about their interactions with the West. And given the fact that there was a lot of criticism in Russia at the time over the decision to pull the troops back from Kiev, it could very well be that the Russians, that the political leadership in Moscow feared the outcry that would happen in Russia if it had turned out that they disregarded all the previous history of bad faith and allowed themselves to be tricked all over again. So that might be the explanation, but what I am fairly confident of is that this is what the Russians are quietly telling people from the global south who come to see them, and who want to discuss negotiations with them. I'm fairly sure that when Putin, for example, met the African leaders over the course of the St. Petersburg summit meeting, and the African leaders pressed him to, talked with him about seeking a diplomatic solution. Putin, as we know, produced, this was before the Africa summit actually, produced the draft agreement that Ukraine had initialed. And I suspect that over the course of the discussion of that draft agreement, Putin might have told the African leaders about the fact that he agreed to Ukraine's request to withdraw troops from around Kiev. And of course, it turned out that that promise was not, that once that was done, the Ukrainians just went back on what they'd agreed. And Putin will have made the point that this shows the extent to which the Ukrainians simply cannot be trusted any longer in negotiations. So, I just thought I would make that observation because I was struck by what the ambassador had said. As I said, I've seen hints of this before. I'd be interested to know, by the way, whether this was true. Until recently, I'd assumed that it was the Russians who decided to pull the troops out of Kiev, from around Kiev, as a goodwill gesture. But as I said, if it was done following a request from Ukraine, that would put the whole affair cast the whole affair in a completely different light, and would be a further reason to think that negotiations from this point on are going to be, to put it mildly, extremely difficult. Anyway, talked about the situation on the front lines being at standstill. I've talked about the difficulties of future negotiations. I've also discussed, both in my previous program and in this program, that we're now just entering the third month of this offensive. Some people in the West, I noticed Michael Kaufman was quoted in that New York Times article as being one of them, are still talking, in my opinion, fantastically about Ukraine resuming the offensive after the end of the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa late in November, if there has been no breakthrough by that point. An incredible idea. And the Russian Defense Ministry has now released its own summary of Ukrainian losses since the offensive began. And I'm going to read what it says. It says the following, and this is taken directly from the Russian Defense Ministry's website. Since the beginning of the so-called offensive by the Kiev regime during June and July, the Ukrainian losses in the course of combat operations have already totaled more than 43,000 servicemen. The figure does not include wounded and foreign mercenaries evacuated to Ukrainian hospitals and abroad, as well as servicemen eliminated as a result of long-range precision weapon strikes in rear areas. Now that's 43,000 men. The bulk of those, we're being led to believe here, were killed. There's probably some prisoners included as well. But the Russians now are saying that this figure of 43,000 does not include wounded and foreign mercenaries evacuated to Ukrainian hospitals. So we must assume 20,000 men, roughly, killed each month. Killed, not killed and wounded, each month in the 2 months of the offensive up to now. Now, I have to say that this is a drastic upgrade of Russian figures. Up to now, when Shoigu has discussed losses, Ukrainian losses, he's talked about, I think it was around 15,000 in June, 26,000 in July, and that's given the impression that we're talking about dead and wounded. Now the Russians are making it clear that they're talking about dead and not dead and wounded. Now, I have no way of corroborating or verifying these figures. That Shoigu, in a meeting of the Russian Security Council at the end of June, when the loss rate of Ukraine was said to be, from recollection, around 13,000 at that time. Anyway, that's my recollection, by the way. I might be wrong on that number. But anyway, Shoigu said that the Russians collate their figures for Ukrainian losses based on information they get from Ukrainian radio intercepts. I've no reason, again, to doubt that. Perhaps the Russians are misunderstanding some of this data, which is highly likely. Perhaps these figures, this figure of 43,000, is too high. Who knows? But it is indisputable that very, very large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed over the course of this offensive. And, of course, tens of thousands of others have been wounded, with many of them receiving amputations, especially after walking on mines. So those people who talk about resuming Ukraine's offensive in the autumn and the winter, I wonder whether they're reckoning with the scale of these losses. Even if these Russian losses, these Russian claims of Ukrainian losses are too high. Because, frankly, even if we divide this by half or even 2/3, this looks like horrible slaughter in which tens of thousands of men are dying and being wounded for, as that one of those 2 American articles that I cited have said, the capture so far of 100 square miles of Russian-controlled territory, which I believe is around 0.01% of the territory that the Russians control and which Ukraine wants to recapture. Is it reasonable? Is it rational? Is it humane to continue to talk about continuing this offensive in light of these sort of losses? Anyway, we can debate, and there are lots of people who do debate this issue, what Ukrainian manpower losses are, but I think we can be a little bit more confident about Russian claims of material losses. And this is what the Russian Ministry of Defense says about those. Over 4,900 units of various Ukrainian weapons have been destroyed on the line of contact, including 26 aircraft, 9 helicopters, 1,831 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles, including 25 German-manufactured Leopard tanks, 7 French AMX wheeled tanks, and 21 US-manufactured Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. In addition, the enemy losses were 747 field artillery pieces and mortars, including 76 US-manufactured M777 artillery systems, as well as 84 self-propelled artillery systems from Poland, the United States, France, and Germany. Now, again, I have no independent way of corroborating these numbers, but I suspect that these numbers are accurate. If a tank is destroyed on the battlefield, there are now swarms of drones, Russian drones there, able to photograph the wreckage. And by the way, I would repeat again that over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have been taking to dispatching Lancet kamikaze drones to destroy totally tanks and armoured vehicles that have been knocked out over the course of the fighting, and to destroy them so that they cannot be taken back to the rear and repaired. And of course, that means that Ukraine can't retrieve these vehicles and can't put them back into battle. Now, these are appalling losses, and perhaps the most important of the figures here are the 25 German-manufactured Leopard 2 tanks, as I said, out of the 60 to 70 that were originally sent to Ukraine. And we're talking about the Leopard 2s. It's unlikely that Ukraine is going to receive any more of these. The tanks that will replace the Leopard 2s, the lost Leopard 2s, far less powerful and effective Leopard 1 tanks, which with much thinner armour, much lighter gun, much easier to destroy for the Russian artillery and the Russian anti-armour systems. Of course, they are going to get the Abrams tanks, and of course the Challenger 2 tanks have never been deployed in the battle, so they won't be entirely without tanks, but 25 German-manufactured Leopard tanks have been destroyed. And we also have this disastrous toll of field artillery pieces and mortars, and 76 US-manufactured M777 artillery systems. I suspect that Ukraine must now be pretty much at the end of its M777 artillery systems. I doubt that the United States has any more to send. They seem to have been systematically destroyed by the Russians. It looks as if the days when the M777 can play a significant role in this war are probably coming to an end, even if again the Russian claims here are exaggerated. And 84 self-propelled artillery systems from Poland. These are the Krab self-propelled guns. I've seen many pictures, by the way, of Krab self-propelled guns being destroyed or having been destroyed. Of course, always one must allow for the possibility of duplication. It could be that some of the photographs showed the destruction of the same vehicle from different angles. That's perfectly willing to accept that, but there's no doubt that quite a lot of these Krabs have been destroyed. And of course, self-propelled guns from the United States, France, and Germany Not Britain, interestingly, though I actually do remember reading one report, one battlefield report, of a British self-propelled gun having been destroyed. Maybe the Russians have gone over the film and photographs and have decided that that wasn't a British self-propelled gun. After all, who's to know? But anyway, we can see that the M109 guns supplied by the United States and Germany, the Caesar howitzers supplied by France, they've all taken losses, according to the Russians. And again, perhaps they're inflating the totals, but here I suspect that we can rely on the figures they're giving with greater confidence than we could about the manpower losses. These are, as I said, bulky pieces of equipment, and it's difficult to conceal their loss on the battlefields, given the amount of surveillance drones that there are operating over these battlefields at this time. So, terrible losses, a terrible disaster, and yet people in the West still saying that Ukraine must press forward, demanding that the offensive continue, talking grandly about it resuming in the late autumn or the winter after the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa. Apparently, Ukraine is to be given no rest. It must continue to attack. It must continue to shed the blood of its men on the battlefields. It must see more and more of them wounded and crippled, even though these articles in the Western media admit that the offensive is now at a standstill. We're told that the concern is not the failure of the offensive, obviously, the fact that the offensive is at a standstill. We're told that it's not these huge losses. We're reassured all the time that Ukraine is acting to preserve the lives of its soldiers, that its priority is to preserve lives. Well, the facts show that that is not the case. Sending lightly armed men advancing against enemy trenches and artillery is not the way to preserve the lives of soldiers. So when the Ukrainian officials say that, that's simply not the case. And as I've discussed many times, even the Western media is admitting that those are the tactics that Ukraine is following now. But in spite of all of that, the concern is not these things. It's not the deaths of soldiers, the woundings, the mutilations, all of those things, the losses of all this expensive equipment. It is fear that the West and Kiev are losing control of the narrative. The narrative is the thing that must be protected at all costs. I have to say that there is so much about this war that is so disturbing and so, I would say straightforwardly, immoral, that I'm often at a complete loss for words to describe how I feel about it. But there we go. That's the reality. Now, I would say that there are some people who have been excitedly jumping at one particular piece of news, the fact that the administration, the Biden administration, is tying aid to Taiwan to the latest request to Congress for funding to keep arming Ukraine. They're saying that this proves that the United States is losing its will to continue to support Ukraine with more and more weapons. Well, that might prove to be true, but I think people are sadly misunderstanding this particular report, because it's absolutely clear to me that the reason that aid to Taiwan is being lumped together with aid to Ukraine is not because there's any intention to slacken off on aid to Ukraine. It is because there is now growing opposition in Congress to providing more aid to Ukraine. There's also more popular opposition. There's been 3 opinion polls in the United States which show that people in the United States are increasingly unhappy about this endless stream of weapons and US tax dollars which are being sent to Ukraine. So the Biden administration is trying to get around that by lumping the unpopular issue of aid to Ukraine with the more popular issue of aid to Taiwan, which enjoys strong bipartisan support in Congress. This is a ruse. It's not a sign that there's a reduction in intention to reduce aid to Ukraine. Now, aid to Ukraine might reduce anyway, but if that is the case, it will be because of capacity issues. The running down of US military stockpiles. It will not be because the desire to continue to provide that aid is not there. So, just to put that particular thing to rest. In the meantime, what about steps to find a solution to this war? Find some kind of way out of this war, a diplomatic solution? I have to say again, there's no real sign of it at the moment. I've noticed that the media in Britain have now quietly lowered the bar for the talks in Vienna. They're no longer talks or a conference. It's now become consultations about possible diplomatic steps to find some way to end the war. Mexico and Brazil have made it clear that they will not participate. The Chinese, who had indicated at one point that they might not do so either, have nonetheless decided to say Li Hui, who is their representative, who's supposedly looking for some mechanism to mediate a compromise. And I understand that India will be attending as well. But consultations doesn't look as if anything very much is really being seriously discussed at this meeting. As I've discussed in several programs, and as we've discussed on the Duran, with Ukraine's failure to break through on the battle lines, this meeting in Jeddah has lost its purpose, and what was supposed to be talks, what was supposed to be a negotiation, has now been lowered, has now been reduced to mere consultations. So no sign of any negotiations, talks, informal talks in Moscow, these so-called Tier 1.5 talks, which I discussed a short while ago, which were spoken about in Moscow Times. But it's clear that those are at an impasse, and at the moment, deadlock in diplomacy, deadlock on the battlefronts, but a deadlock on the battlefronts which is unstable and which is unlikely to last very long. As I discussed yesterday, 231,000 men have enlisted in the Russian army this year. Looks like if that trend continues, we could be seeing something like 400,000 men enlisting in the Russian army by the end of this year. They will all, of course, require training. It doesn't mean that the Russian army will have grown in size by 400,000 men by the winter, but hundreds of thousands of Russian troops are being assembled. The military industries in Russia are operating at high tempos, producing more and more weapons. It seems to me that it is only a question of time now before the Russians decide to resume their offensive, and it will take a very different form when that happens to the offensive which took place in the spring of 2022. Now, in talking about this, yesterday I discussed at length the situation of the Russian economy, and I said that the depreciation of the ruble, the purpose of the softening of the ruble, which I'm quite sure myself, as I said, the Russian authorities will never admit to this, but in my opinion, the depreciation of the ruble is at least in part intended to support the budget, the Russian budget, by increasing oil and gas revenues as they flow into the budget. And sure enough, today there's a piece in Bloomberg that says that very, very same thing. And this article, as articles in Bloomberg often do, it says that Russia expects $11 billion energy windfall in 2023 despite cap. In fact, an earlier title to this article says that Russian oil and gas revenues, energy revenues, are now recovering on the back of the rise in energy prices and the depreciation of the ruble. And in fact, latest charts show that energy receipts for the budget are now finally rising and are not just matching, but exceeding the budget plan. And I suspect this will probably go on until the end of the year, and will ensure that if Russia does run a deficit this year, it will be fairly small, as I've always said. If there's a big takeoff in energy prices, as I know some people are now starting to think, well, perhaps the budget will come close to balance. I can't quite believe it will reach a surplus, even if there is a huge surge, because I suspect the Russian government will want to use any windfall it gets at this particular juncture for extra spending, be it on the war or on other matters. Now, I have read claims that a third of the Russian budget is being used to fund the war. I think that is unlikely to be true. I haven't seen a proper breakdown of this. Just a short while ago, there were reports that suggested the contrary, that the expense of the war, the cost of the war, which I presume to be the cost not just of the war itself, but of the entire Russian military spending, is still only just above 3% of GDP. And of course, GDP is growing, and the Russian government has again reiterated that they now are confident that GDP growth this year will be above 2%. They are saying that they're still working on a proper forecast. So there we go. There was one other thing about the depreciation of the ruble which I just wanted to add to my comments from yesterday, which is that, of course, for most Russians, this is not a big issue anymore. The days when middle class and working class Russians were able to travel to the West have ended. They no longer have to therefore convert their rubles into dollars. And of course, the Russian government has been busy working out other holiday destinations for them in places like Egypt and Turkey, and by the way, Cuba, no doubt China as well, India, places which increasingly are going to start accepting Mir cards, and where the changes in the ruble exchange rate will not be particularly problematic, because several of these countries have currencies that are even softer at this particular moment in time than the ruble itself is. So there we go. That's the situation as of today. We're in a relatively quiet period in global politics. It is the summer, August. August, by the way, is a dangerous month. People go on holidays, political leaders go on holidays. The sort of people who are left in charge are often more junior people. They don't always keep things fully under control in the way that their seniors can do. Though given, frankly, the calibre of some of those seniors, especially in the West, who knows, it might be that the juniors are better at their job than the seniors are. But of course, it's also been the case that many recent wars, many of the big recent wars, have started in August. The First World War, and indeed the Second World War. The events leading up to both, to a great extent, culminated in August. So it is an uneasy quiet, and of course, in the meantime, the war goes on. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. I'll keep you obviously informed of any progress on the battlefronts. We'll see whether this time the Ukrainians are able to achieve some progress south of Orechov. Unlikely, though, I have to say, that appears to me. Perhaps the more interesting question is what the Russians are going to do on the northern front lines. And, of course, the situation in the Black Sea is troubling, and we will see whether we get any statements soon from the Russians, providing some explanations as to what they think is happening with these drones, and whether, as part of those explanations, they point the finger at any NATO states. So that's what I wanted to say. That's all I'm going to say today. There'll be more from me soon. All that remains, therefore, is for me to wish you a very good day. To remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And also you can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all those great things. So that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.